So welcome back, everyone. This is our second session of From Theory to Practice, Creating Organizational Change and Health Equity. My name is Rihanna Durbin-Matrone. I work for Partners for Advancing Health Equity as the project manager for research and evaluation. And so if you're new to the session, that's okay. Just a reminder that we will send out a packet after everything. And then throughout today's discussion, also feel free to jump in the chat with questions, and then we will have some discussion time throughout the hour today. I just want to now take the time to introduce Dr. Jaboa Lake and thank her for all of the work that she's put into this, and very excited to get this rolling.
Thank you for that. Can folks hear me okay? Great. I've been reading the chat, so I appreciate you doing the intro so I could, bask in all of the things that people are doing to introduce themselves. Definitely seeing some familiar faces and familiar names, so welcome. And I know a good number of folks from this group were able to join us last week, and there's some that are just joining us this week. So I will go over an overview of what we talked about last week. But as was mentioned, all of the materials from last week from links and resources and slides will be made available on the collective Padlet, and along with this week's materials, next week's materials. Again, this is a session where we want to be able to kind of learn and grow with each other. So as we talk together, very much encourage folks to put links in the chat, resources in the chat, because those will continue to contribute to the collective resources for this group to take back with us. So thank you for that. Continue to introduce yourself in the chat. Say a hello to people if you recognize them as they're saying, welcoming themselves and introducing themselves also. But with that, just a quick overview, this is second session out of 3 for the Organizational Change for Health Equity series. And this, the first session was really about learning together, and this session is really about discussing together. And then the next session will be about creating together. And I'll go over a little bit of what that means practically about how we spend our time together. So you saw this slide last time, but I just wanted to go over it again. That last time we really focused on thinking about traditional harms of research and alternatives to harmful practices, and thought about integrating both data and narrative strategies specifically for decision-making practices for organizational change that really centered equity. And then this week, it says we'll do small group discussion. We won't, actually we'll do big group discussion. We just wanted to give a warning when we do breakouts, but we're not doing breakouts this week. So sorry about that edit. But this week we will be identifying guiding values and narratives, and we'll be talking about things like choice points, power shifting practices, and some equity assessment tools that we can learn from in our work. And then next week, we'll be more creating together. We'll really be honing in all of the discussions that we had last week and this week in building out, what are our shared set of values and principles and practices that we can kind of bundle together, share back to you all, and you can actually take with you in your work and utilize and use as resources too. And a quick overview of what we went over last week for folks who are just joining us, and for folks who like a little bit of a reminder. Again, last week we went over traditional harms of research and alternatives to harmful practices. And specifically, we talked about different methodologies. So we talked about decolonizing methodologies, liberatory methodologies, critical quantitative methodologies, and how all of these things can contribute to the small shifts in our practice and the small decisions that we can make that actually have large impacts, especially around equity and especially for communities in mind. We also talked about reflecting on how we have shifted practices in our work. So we had folks engage with a Mentimeter poll where they talked really practically about the ways that they've shifted in their work. So here's a couple of screenshots from responses from last week where we asked people about the types of narratives that impact their work, such as things around zero-sum thinking, equity as a luxury, work being too expensive, equity work putting staff in harm's way, these types of narratives that sometimes harm our work, sometimes help our work, but they are, ever present. We have to kind of address them and deal with them along the way. And then we also had some great responses to the prompt around how folks have engaged in values-aligned frameworks to shift from, traditional or standard practices in their work. And folks talked about engaging in community-based work, looking at asset-based community development, forming accountability groups, updating strategic plans, all these really practical things that folks were doing in their work to shift practices towards a more equitable practice. So that's a quick and dirty overview of last week. Of course, all the slides will be made available and you can look at those, and those have way more in-depth pieces to remind yourself and to engage in. But for this week, we're going to focus a lot on a couple of things. We're going to think about and reflect on things like power. We're going to reflect on things like values. And then we're also going to think about what does that mean for assessing our work and assessing how much our work is actually engaging in equity practices in the ways that we really want to. And some folks might be familiar with this wheel. This is the wheel of power and privilege. And pretty much what it shows is that we have multiple identities and multiple positionalities, and each of those identities and positionalities are differently related to power in a context. Some identities we may have or some access we might have is closer to power, while some are further from power. But what this type of wheel really makes us reflect on is that we are really complex people, and that complexity has led us to have different worldviews and different value sets, and those worldviews and value sets really directly change how we engage in decision making, how we utilize our power, how we recognize our power, and what that means for our work. So power in itself, we want to have intersectional approaches that don't just look at one domain of identity or one domain of positionality, but look at multiple ones, and really think about how this contributes to the construction of power in our work, which then impacts our decision-making, impacts our practice, impacts the people who are being impacted by the work that we do. So overall, power does a lot of things. It decides what's legitimate. When we think about building community power, a lot of that work is about legitimizing community-based work and showing that that is a viable tactic, it's a viable strategy, and it's oftentimes the most effective one. Power also decides what is considered things like knowledge or truth. And we talked about this last week too, when we talked about the kind of who is researched versus who is the researcher, and whose knowledge is considered truth. So if we're engaging in community-based research or community-based decision-making practices, that means that we're acknowledging that the community has the knowledge or the truth that's essential to make decisions. But unless something's maybe published in a report or an academic journal, it's maybe not legitimized as actual knowledge or truth. So when we engage in a really critical analysis of power, then we can rethink about what is knowledge and what is truth, and then use that to actually make decisions about how we do our work. And we also talked about, we can talk about power in how it impacts things like prioritizing things, planning things, and making assessments of things. So if we are thinking about a group who may be trying to make a 5-year, health equity plan for a regional area, what health equity plan is constructed and what issues are prioritized may be, decided by practitioners, people on boards, people in leadership positions. Community may not be asked at all to engage with that because they have relatively less power in those decision-making practices. But what that means is that we're missing a lot. We're missing that knowledge, we're missing that truth, we're missing a lot of really legitimate ways of approaching health equity on the ground. And then that planning process and the assessments of how well health is being addressed in that area are going to be off, because at the end of the day, the power that was being utilized in that process wasn't actually closest to the issue or closest to where the impacts are going to be held. So this is just a reflection on, we are individual people in the work, and we can't pretend that we're not. And as individual people, we make decisions and we make choices that are informed by our positionality and our power. We can also think about the role of folks like researchers and decision makers whose work directly impacts programs, policies. And this is another graphic that may look familiar to some folks. This comes from Deepa Iyer, who works on the Solidarity Is project with the Building Movement project. Really great work. But Deepa's work really recognizes that there is room for everyone in change, in social change, in movement change, in building together. So we need storytellers, we need frontline responders, we need caregivers. So that what this tends to do is it expands who we can think about is invited to the table and whose voice is valuable. So for example, if we're building out a strategic plan, we're having a strategy table that's helping us build out our strategic plan, we may bring in strategizers. We may bring in people who have done this a lot, but by recognizing that there is room for other people, there are room for healers and disruptors and weavers, then we can recognize the unique value add that each positionality brings to that process. And at the end of the day, it fundamentally changes how we engage with decision making, what decisions are made, how we meaning make from research that informs decision making. So there are a number of roles that we can think about researchers and decision makers having beyond just those titles of researcher or decision maker. Oftentimes we work in partnership or we build coalitions with others, and that's a key role in building relationships and working in cross-movement strategies. We also often have a lot of resources and we have a lot of skills to share. So what does it mean to not just hold resources or hold our skills internally, but to, promote spaces that share them, similar to these sessions that are hosted, for you all too. This is a space for resource and skill sharing. So it's not just held within ourselves, but is shared out and then builds those resources and skills that we can all collectively work with. Again, we're strategic planners and we're designers too. So a researcher isn't just a designer, there's somebody who make recommendations, who talk about meaning making. They often are the ones that say, this is maybe what we should think about in this policy or program because of the evidence that we've seen or what we've heard from the ground. So that is a very strategic move. So researchers and decision makers themselves are strategic, even if they're not centered around a lot of the strategy building sessions. We're also evaluators and meaning makers. So this is something that happens all the time. I tend to say we've always been evaluators. So there is sometimes, that title that can make folks feel like they can't contribute to an evaluation process or a learning or iterative process. But at the end of the day, especially for people of color or marginalized people, we've constantly been the folks who have been doing radical experiments on the ground, addressing our issues where we see them happen, even when we don't have funding, even when we don't have infrastructure from organizations. But in that work, we're also evaluating constantly, and we're making meaning of the work that we're doing. So those are practices that we can invite into our work also. So for example, when COVID hit, we saw a bunch of mutual aid groups pop up in different locations. And a lot of these mutual aid groups would do things like organize spaces for folks to bring food and redistribute food, or spaces for folks to bring PPE and distribute PPE. And folks would, choose a location and they did do distribution. Sometimes they had to reflect and were like, actually, this location wasn't accessible to the community, so maybe we have to move this location. So that process in itself is a form of grassroots experimentation and evaluation and reflection that then contributed to a program design change. So inviting that type of thinking into our work and affirming that those reflections and debriefs are part of our work can help us bring in that iterative process as researchers and decision makers, so that we're not just kind of stuck in our way of doing things without being conscious of its impact. We're also program and policy implementers. I kind of talked about that a little bit just now. And then similar to what we talked about last time, we're also narrative and culture shifters. So the way that we talk about our work, the type of language that we use, who we bring in to speak on the work or storytell shifts narrative and shifts culture fundamentally. And we know that culture and narrative strategies are rooted in values. So those values that we decide to root the work in are going to impact not just narrative and culture shifters, but also all of the other pieces. It impacts how we think about policies, how we think about programs, how we make decisions, and the culture and around infrastructures that support those processes. So with all that, I did want to introduce this concept of the 4 arenas of power. And this is something that Race Forward has developed and used for folks to really reflect on what kind of power might we actually have, and then what do we do when we need to move within our power. So the 4 arenas of power are a way to really offer a framework for folks to reflect on their particular role. So I'm sure that folks that are in this space are going to be seeing these 4 arenas of power and say, like, this is one that I think that I probably have more access to, or this is an arena of power I have less access to. But when we think about strategic decision making and strategic moving in the ways that we want to move organizations towards equity, we want to really format groups and cultivate power across these arenas of power so that we're touching on different areas. But that doesn't mean that one person or one organization needs to have access to all of them, which is one of the strengths of working together in coalition, as I've mentioned in a slide before. So within these arenas of power, we think a lot about what we call decision-making power, which we've talked a lot about in these sessions quite a bit. We talk about narrative and cultural power, which we talked about a little bit last week. We talk about resource and structural power, and we also talk about relational and imaginative power. So I'll go over all four of these quickly because I do want to kind of ground us in these arenas. And as I'm talking about them, I'd invite you to think about within your position, in your role, and whatever affiliation, your organization, your institution, thinking about what types of arenas of power might you hold, what arena of power might your organization or institution hold, and maybe where are some gaps where you're maybe not as empowered in those areas, but you may be able to work with another group or work with another person to kind of fill those power gaps. So around decision-making power, this is really about who gets to set direction, choose priorities, say yes or no to things. It's pretty straightforward, but it's pretty powerful, you know. Decision-making power is often something that is held from a top-down strategy. And we can think about like moving within our values where we might want to subvert that and think about decision-making power that empowers folks at the grassroots or empowers folks that are most directly impacted by the issues that we're addressing. But by attuning to decision-making power, we can think about, you know, where do we maybe not have decision-making power where we're kind of answering to someone else. So for example, if we have a grant that is going to be really impactful on our community, but that grant charge is saying to, you know, check all of these boxes that are maybe not as relevant as we'd like them to be, they're having implicit decision-making power about how we structure our work, even if we can kind of get around those requirements a little bit and make it fit what we see the need is in the community. That decision-making power about what is prioritized is still held at a certain level. And then around narrative and cultural power, this is really around who gets to shape things like meaning, define norms, and decide what's legitimate or desirable. And this is actually really powerful because narrative and culture is something that is present in our everyday lives. It underlines every decision we make. It underlines how we interact with each other. So even though it's present in our organizations, it's something that we have in our families, have in our communities, and we bring it with us in our professional settings. We bring it with us as organizers. We bring it with us as administrators, as publishers, as all of the roles that are present in this room right now. And those contribute to then organizational narrative and cultural power. And we can think about how our organization's narrative and cultural power then shapes the field and shapes the kind of norms or what is seen as legitimate or desirable. So for example, if we're thinking about justice-oriented organizations who are really about, you know, uplifting conditions for folks who are marginalized, addressing equity issues, and this organization maybe has a unionizing effort that's happening, but that organization decides that they actually don't want a union, and they're defining the norms then for the field, saying that even though we're a justice-based organization, we're going to be anti-labor in this way. And that says a lot about the kind of narratives that are being pushed around who's included in the work, how we value people's voices, and how we value people's labor and time, which changes the culture of the decision-making kind of bodies that we work into. So there are all of these different ways that we bring in narrative and cultural power into our work, but it's something that's just ever present, even when we're not making decisions. And then we also have things like resource and structural power. And this is about who controls access to money, space, labor, time, rules, policy, and tools. And this can be very, very high level, and it can make or break the work. There's sometimes kind of that joke that people say around, we were going to change the world, but we didn't get the grant. And it's this tongue-in-cheek saying that pretty much says that, you know, there are decision makers and resource givers and structure holders that make all of the decisions. And if we're not included in that power, then we really can't engage in the work at all. So there's a lot of organizations that are really pushing against that, saying we're going to engage in the work even maybe without resource and structural power, or with less resource and structural power. And we can really think about that in these moments too, where there has been so many resources stripped from the types of works that I'm sure a lot of people on this call engage in. There's been a lot of resources stripped from our collaborators, folks who do work on the ground. And we're in a really volatile situation right now about resourcing and structural power. But we also know at the end of the day that even when that power is being stripped, folks are still continuing to engage in the work. And what we're doing instead is rethinking what resources and structures we need. So if something is being removed from us, from the type of power that we hold in one area, where can we build that out instead? So if we lost a grant and we no longer have funding to do a certain type of project, is there a way we can use relational power and partner with somebody else to then fill in some of those resources that we lost and still get the good work going? So just naming resource and structural power, that it's one of those areas there where we realistically have to address when it's stripped from us, and have to pivot. So even within the four arenas of power, it is about building power, but it's also about shifting the ways that we define and think about power as available to us. And then the last one, which I previewed a little bit, was around relational and imaginative power. And this is really about who has the ability to build trust, hold vision, and marshal the capacity to move together. And this is really the action-oriented and the forward-thinking piece of the arenas of power too. So it's not only about who we relate to, how we work together, who we build trust with, how we decide to work in against silos and against siloed practices that may be kind of part of other cultures that have power. But really, how do we use those to then be imaginative to work together to move forward? So if we think about, a larger strategy in like an equity movement, a strategy is made up of a lot of different smaller tactics. And one organization may be really great at one tactic, such as direct services, while another organization or institution may be really great at another tactic, such as research or evaluation. So when we think about relational imaginative power, when we strengthen the relations across different tactics, across different positionalities, across different kind of accesses to resources or structures, we're then able to build a stronger future together, which is part of that imaginative power. So if we were limited in certain pieces of power, then it's going to be really hard to see how we can build together. But when we see the work cross movement or cross organizations, we can really expand the imagination of what is accessible to us in the ways that we move in our organizations. Oops, sorry, let me go back one. This should be familiar to the folks who were able to join us last week, but I just wanted to reintroduce this model that we call the choice points model. So this is a model that Race Forward uses in this set of trainings that we call our decision making for racial equity trainings. And it's a great training if folks want to check it out. That training happens, I think, quarterly. And it's a 3-hour workshop where you do deep dives utilizing tools and toolkits. And within the choice points framework, it really addresses that at every point in our work, even the small points, we are constantly making choices. And we can make choices that are kind of the same traditional choices and actions, and those are going to have the same outcomes that we've seen around inequity, exclusion, racism. Or we can actively make equitable options and choices and actions, and those are going to have new outcomes like equity, inclusion, and the prevention of harm. And it's one of those ones especially when we talk about the status quo or traditional actions, we get so in the habit of moving along with the status quo that it sometimes doesn't even feel like a choice to be made at all. It just feels like a habit, or that's the way that we do things. But when we allow ourselves to stop and say, actually, is there opportunity to make a different choice here? Is there an opportunity to address this policy or this program differently? Then we're opening ourselves up to new outcomes that are more aligned with the values that we want to lead. So just reintroducing this particular framework, because it really pushes against the idea that we just kind of have to move along with the actions, and invites us to pause and actually recognize, where do we have choice points to make, and how can we utilize our power at that choice point to do something differently that is actually going to move us towards our goals. Within this, we've been talking about values, but we also talk about principles, and then we talk about practice and praxis. And praxis is the application of our values to our practice. So when we think about like the difference between practice and praxis, practice can be just how we move and how we do things. And practice can be a status quo practice. But when we think about praxis, it's the really conscious and intentional inclusion of our named values in the way that we do things, which again, fundamentally changes the ways that we engage in our work, how we utilize our power, how we even pause to recognize our power. And these all have direct implications then for policies, programs, impacts on communities, everything that we care about across everything that y'all named in your intros. So we do have this framework that we utilize that we in a lot of trainings. And this really came from a research training. So it is from a research perspective, but similar to other areas, it's something that can be applied to decision making. It can be applied to strategy building. It can be applied to a lot of different things. So when we think about values, principles, and practices, we want to name like, actually, what are we talking about when we say these? Because oftentimes when folks are talking about things like values, principles, and practices, like how many times have you looked at a set of values on an organization's website and you said, you know, I know that you don't actually practice those values. I know that you don't live those values. It's just said there and it's not taken anywhere else. And we know that, you know, naming things or doing research or making decisions that actually have no action tied to them are not helpful at all. So how do we actually engage within ourselves in our own practices in making sure that we're accountable to ourselves and our organizations to move towards action when we're thinking about our values? So when we do that, we can then be explicit, you know, what are our values? So if we think about values, these are things like our core beliefs that then guide our actions. We also think about then what is a principle that might emerge from that value? And a principle then is a criterion that is guided by values. And I'm going to give a couple of examples. And then from that criterion, we can think about, well, what is the actual like practical thing, the actual action that can come out of this values-driven or this principle-based practice? So these practice or practices about how values and principles are tangibly showing up in our methodology, in our decision-making, in the ways that we decide to move within our work. So I'll give a couple of examples that might resonate with some folks here. So for example, if we say that we have a grassroots or a bottom-up value, if that's something that we name, that's something that I say that's important to me, that's important to the work I do, well, what does that mean for the principles? If I'm thinking about things being grassroots, then as a principle, then I would think maybe any strategic planning that I do needs to be driven by the people that are most impacted. That's a principle that I'm like, this is a value of mine. So this is a principle that I need to have that really is undergirding the ways that I do my work. And in the practice, the really tangible piece of that could be something like strategic planning that is led by or engages communities closest to the issue. And this seems really simple, but at the same time, actually implementing these types of strategies, we can get a lot of pushback. There can be challenges. There can be resources that stop us from doing so. So that's where the challenge actually comes in about how do we actually move within our practices. But by even going through the process of naming the value, what principle can come from that, and how we can implement that in our practice gets us to that point to action. So if we're just naming our values and saying we're grassroots, we're bottom up, now what? You know, what does that mean for what we actually do? What does that mean for how we advocate for resources to implement that? So this type of framework allows us to actually take us through the journey of getting to that more tangible piece of the practice. Another quick example I'll give is that if we say we have a value of community self-determination, then a principle can be something like, well, then we affirm that communities have ownership of their own narratives. That we're not trying to give them a voice, we're not trying to have a voice for them, we're just trying to uplift community voices, uplift community storytelling, uplift community narratives. This could mean that in practice, like if you're engaging in something like research or meaning making, that you can have community leadership in data analysis, in meaning making, in dissemination. That doesn't necessarily need to be held by us as folks in positions of relative power, but it can be something that we extend power to or uplift grassroots power to then actually practice that value of community self-determination. And then you can also have, you know, a specific goal that helps guide your values and principles. So this is just an example from Race Forward's strategic plan where we have a value of racial equity. It's pretty, you know, central to everything we do. Our name is Race Forward. That's exactly all of the work. And one of the goals in our strategic plan is having a just multiracial democracy where communities of color win governing power. So within that, we've named a set of principles that we do in our work. And this is our work from our research to our programs, to our cohorts, to our conferences and convenings, to our webinars. Everything that we do then is led by these principles. So we name that we use a systems analysis in our work. And this helps us move away from those narratives of individualizing problems to identifying systems that contribute to problems. We use racially equitable methodology. So again, pushing against the status quo and being really conscious about the ways that the methods that we use in our work impact racial equity. We also are race explicit, and I know this is a moment where not everyone can be race explicit, but in our work, that's something that we're able to affirm at this time, where we want to explicitly say where racial equity is happening, where it's not happening. And, there are completely other strategies that folks are really doing great work in, where they've had to move away from being race explicit, but they found other strategies to continue to do equity work without maybe necessarily getting themselves in trouble. And I just want to acknowledge that these moments are a little bit different, and there are different levels of risk that each organization and individual may be able to approach in preserving the good work that they do. We also engage with communities who are most impacted. So again, instead of moving with the assumptions that, I may have read all these books and went to all these community meetings, I learned about this issue, but if I'm not the one that's impacted, there's going to be a qualitatively different engagement investment in decision making. So by engaging communities most impacted, then we're consciously moving away from those assumptions. And then we also have a really explicit goal of advancing racial equity outcomes across all of the work we do. So if the work we're doing isn't in some way advancing racial equity outcomes, we have to question with ourselves, why are we doing the work? And that's a question I would very much invite everybody who cares about equity work doing. If equity is a central outcome in the work you're doing, really thinking about the work that you're doing and saying, is this actually contributing to equity? And if it isn't, how can I shift it to contribute to equity? And if I can't, why am I putting my energy there? And some of those real answers may be because I have to be able to access this equity project over here, or I have to because I may lose my position, which would then hurt me from furthering this. But those are still pretty critical kind of reflections that we can ask ourselves about moving towards the goal, moving towards that kind of North Star that we affirm for ourselves. So that was a lot of, frameworks and talking, but I'm also interested from this group to share with each other, as you were reflecting on power, as you were reflecting on your own values, in the chat, if you all don't mind taking a moment to reflect and then putting in the chat, what are some of the values that inform how you use your power in your role? And again, this is about reflecting on our positionality, our organization's positionality, and thinking about what are the values that I actually do lean into. So I invite folks to reflect on that for a couple of seconds and to start putting in the chat so folks can see your response to the values that you lead in your role. And as folks feel ready, feel free to put those values into the chat and start naming those. Seeing a couple things coming in. Humanism, naming that you're not sure if it's a value, but in the work that you do, I try not to be race or class blind in it because it just perpetuates the status quo, which is racist and anti-labor. Respecting and respecting differences, the right to make choices according to cultural beliefs. I lead from love in all I do. So I'm seeing respect, love, culture. I'm seeing folks talking about being explicit in how you name the work that you do, respect and empathy, compassion, class and race consciousness. Yes, that's that intersection specifically too is what I'm hearing from you. More empathy and compassion and respect, dignity in all caps. That's a big one, definitely. Being community-centered, empathy, equity over equality. That's something too. In some of the work that we do, we really unpack the differences between equity, equality, and then we push it a little bit further towards liberation. And what would that look like as a next step in those values? Shared humanity. So this really collective way of thinking about our wellness and our conditions. Is there anyone that feels comfortable coming off mute to share their values or a reflection of a value that they're seeing in the chat?
May I discuss something? Because I would love how people to know everyone's view on that. Because I mentioned my value is race and class conscious approach in everything I do. And this is especially hard for me to navigate because even though I do health equity research, I am in a public health division. And there is always a pushback like, oh, we're doing science, it is not advocacy. And anytime you try to bring in language of equity, justice, or anything like that, there is this pushback about, oh, science is not the place for advocacy. And it goes beyond academia as well. Like I am part of a grassroots level organization that is about urbanism, like making the city I live in more equitable, more pedestrian friendly, more public transit friendly, and all that. But it is dominated by pretty affluent white cis het males. And like in their approach, they are never acknowledging the power they have in like decision making or policies they push to the city government, or like the pushback I receive whenever I'm talking about equity. I think somebody mentioned here, you mentioned here that equity is considered a luxury. So in a lot of spaces, I think that equity is considered something you do optionally if you have more resources. It's not a fundamental value of what you do. And I think that whenever you are taking race, class, or any other like gender or sexual orientation, gender expression blind approaches in anything, I feel like it perpetuates the existing inequities that we have, because like the system, the oppression is so structural that if you do not actively address those, the structure will just keep perpetuating the issues.
I love all of that. Thank you so much for sharing that. The first part of what you said reminded me of this quote by Kurt Lewin, who is a social scientist from about 80 years ago. But he has this quote that I think centers a lot of it, where he says that research that produces only books does nothing. And really acknowledges that it's actually essential that research and the work that folks do are action oriented, that they produce change in some way, or else why are we doing it? And we can think about the discussion on like the construction of knowledge. If work is only being done for the construction of knowledge, then what is it actually doing? And is our values aligned with just constructing knowledge, or is it our values about being action oriented? So I really appreciate those reflections that you are having, but at the reality, there is pushback in actually moving in those ways. So how can we support each other as a field in when we want to engage in action? So for example, you all might be part of these, but there are emergent groups that happen. So I may be positioned here and another person may be positioned here, and we're all frustrated that we are not able to take as many action steps as we want to in our work. So we make an action task force across our organizations. And now we make that something that isn't part of our learning, part of our practice, and part of our support system, so that we can lean on each other to actually get that work done and to move the needle around organizational functioning and structures too. I see that Lyndon, it says, totally agree. You cannot work with Native people without acknowledging their cultural and belief systems. And then people talking about, Darcy saying equitable access to services, portions of fundings going towards to providing no cost sampling services with transportation support. So a lot of this really practical resourcing piece too. So thank you for that reflection. Is there another person that would like to either respond or reflect? In the chat, I'm going to put a link to a toolkit that we provide for folks as part of our trainings. This is our Values to Principles to Praxis toolkit. So along with the slides that I just showed, this particular toolkit, and I'll show you all real quick on my screen, has some actual just templates and activities that we encourage folks to use in their work. So if someone's like, actually, I need to include this kind of reflection of values in my work, how do I do that? So this particular toolkit's for that. So we have a couple of frameworks that we include, such as the ones that I had reviewed with you all. And then we just have space for people to reflect. What is a value? What is a principle? To name those, to name the goals of the work that you do, and really naming like who is the goal for and why, centering that around the work. And then space to reflect on how we're actually engaging in principles and practices at different stages in our work. And again, this is about research stages, but this is something you could do around a strategic planning process. You could do it in a decision-making process where you're identifying the stages, naming the principles that you want to lead with, and then naming how you can actually practice those principles at different stages of your work. So just an offering to you all in this particular space. And I'll move on to another resource that we wanted to provide for folks and see if folks have reflections here. So another area of work that Race4 does a lot of, all of our work is in partnership. I should name that first. So we don't do a lot of work that is just internal to an organization. We really value partnership. Most of our work is in partnership with grassroots organizations, local jurisdictions, equity organizations, academic institutions, labor unions, grassroots, mutual aid groups, a whole bunch of things. We work with practitioners and publishers, and we work folks who work in media. But at the end of the day, that means that we work with a lot of folks who come to us to get some guidance on how they can actually assess how much they're moving towards equity in their work. So this racial equity assessment tool was developed quite a while ago, but it's been a tool that we've gotten a lot of great feedback from and has been taken up by a number of organizations in assessing their own work and really taking that pause to see if they're moving in the types of values that they would like to move in. So the racial equity impact assessment tools are really about having a systemic examination of how different groups will likely be affected by a proposed action or decision or program or policy or anything that your particular work is engaged in. And this is a tool for preventing institutional racism and for identifying new options to remedy longstanding inequities. So again, going back to that choice point, this is one of those types of tools that makes you pause in that choice point, recognize that there is a choice to be made and a new choice that could be explored in your work. And then we use these to minimize unanticipated adverse consequences in things like the analysis of proposed policies, institutional practices, programs and strategic plans, and then also in budgetary decisions. So I linked the tool there for you all to access. It's on our website, so anyone can access that. And just a screenshot of the main part of the tool, which has 10 different areas that we have a number of different activities and engagements that we will technically support organizations around. So this is one of those tools where you can take this tool and design your own activities or engage in your own activities, but we also work in partnership to say, if an organization is in particular looking at they're really concerned with like number 7, advancing equitable impacts. We have a whole bank of, really great activities and resources and strategies to address that particular stage. So there are 10 stages. Some organizations may be like, we need to address this one. Like, we really need to talk about how we engage stakeholders. That's like main for us right now. Or you could say like, we want to address all 10 of these things and then help it inform how we make decisions, how we format our programs, how we engage with communities, how we even define our work at all. So just offering this particular tool. And then I'm also seeing in the chat, Community Campus Partnerships for Health, great friends over there. I love you all too. So welcome, Angela. They work with CBOs and academic institutions, and they have principles of partnership. So offering that link, that's beautiful. Thank you, Angela, for sharing that. And I can see that as a great complement and partner in this type of tool too. So I appreciate you sharing that. So within this, I do want to pause for a second and think about some prompts that may come from the reflections on racial equity impact assessments, our situations within power, and invite folks to kind of reflect on a couple of key questions. And these are questions you can take back with you in your work and also reflect on right now around where your work has addressed power in decision-making for equity, and really being honest about where your work has addressed power in a way that has benefited maybe an organization over a community, where your work has addressed power, where they've prioritized a funder over those impacted by the work. And what does that mean in how you make decisions for equity? We also want to invite you all to think about what kind of power do you hold in your role? So around those arenas of power and thinking about other types of power that you might have. So when we do think about power, we think about media power, we think about money power, we think about relational power, really being sharp about we have power, we don't have power, but what kind of power do we have? And maybe what kind of power do our partners have that we can access? And what kind of power can we share out with with others to then shift the field and not just the organizations that we work in? And we can also think about how we can shift organizations with this power. So within my positionality, within my role in my organization, or within my role in my institution, I may have a unique set of power that others might not have, and I may be able to use that towards some of that organizational change. And we'll also invite you to to ask yourselves, where have you experienced barriers and roadblocks? Because the reality is we can talk about this is what we want to do, and this is how we want to exercise our power, and this is how we want to build power, but there are true barriers and roadblocks. So sometimes we need to take a step back and be like, even to get to that point, we need to address these barriers and roadblocks. And how do we think creatively about addressing those barriers and roadblocks? So similar to that example I gave earlier about if you have funding cut, and now there's a barrier around resourcing and resource power, what would it mean to just deepen our relationships in a way that we can actually cultivate power together and share resources that keep the work going, which could change the type of work that we do, and it could change the way that we engage in our work, but at the end of the day, it strengthens it by addressing those barriers and roadblocks. And then again, around in general, what type of power building might be needed. So around those arenas of power, you may be really strong in, 2 out of 3, 2 out of 4, 3 out of 4. But there may be one area where it's really actually hampering the ability to do the work in the ways that you want to, especially when it's values driven. So where might power building be needed, and how can we build power building into our strategic plans? How can we build power building into our programs? How can we build power building into our policies? So that is something that is being strengthening along the way. I'm also seeing another comment. To be honest, some universities bending over backwards and erasing equity-centered language to meet the funders' needs rather than fighting back is kind of the biggest reflection I'm having right now about the state of academia. Yeah, and that's a big one. It's frustrating. I definitely want to affirm all of that honesty that you put there too. So thank you for that reflection. And to be honest, it's one of these moments where when we address things like power and change, we don't always know what's coming next. We can't always predict what's happening. So how do we build a strong foundation in the work that we do that is already actually driven by our values, that's already actually moving in that direction, so that when we do face challenges, we have that alternative way of moving already. If we can push against the status quo, then we already have that muscle that we've been practicing along the way. So there are a lot of practices around, getting ready, so that we, staying ready so we don't have to get ready, but really making sure that we're prepared for the moments that are more challenging and anticipating those. I'm sure many people on this call last year, like many organizations and institutions, did a lot of scenario planning. We did a lot of scenario planning. We read a lot of documents about threats that were coming our way, but actually living in it is a completely different thing. So we can scenario plan all day long, but if we're not practicing the exercise that we need to actually address in those scenarios, then it makes us really hesitant to do that in the moment too. So even though we're in the thick of a lot of challenges right now, if there are ways that we can continue to practice, like today, actually, I'm really going to affirm my value of transparency, and I'm going to make decisions about my work to implement practices around transparency, so that when challenges around transparency come, we've practiced it. We have an established, baseline. We have an established practice that we can share with others that may be struggling with it later on too. So just inviting that, not always being responsive, being preparatory in the ways that we want to establish our organizations and establish our work to be stronger in these moments. So with all of that, I know we're almost at the hour, and that was a lot of, kind of offering of frameworks and some reflections. I really appreciate the reflections in the chat. One thing that we've talked about as facilitators is making sure that these reflections are summarized, so that the strategies that are uplifted, the reflections that are had, the discussions are then, given back to you all, so that you can continue to muddle with those and sit with those. And as I mentioned, this is 3 parts. So today we did talk a lot about values and narratives. We talked about choice points, power, shifting practices. And then next week, we're going to be spending time really creating together around what are some of the emergent and shared strategies that we can lean into and share with each other. And what are some of the really practical practices for change that we can make sure are centered in our work too. So beyond just the theoretical, but really about the action-oriented piece. And I'm hearing some great examples in the chat and from folks about the action-oriented piece too. And another reiteration that the Mentimeter, where folks were responding last week that have really great action-oriented strategies, that's something that we'll also be sharing back with you all also. So next week, we're going to do a lot of learning together from each other's strategies, especially because so many folks in this room come from different roles and different positionalities, where we need to learn from each other to be able to best implement the work that we're doing. I'm seeing a couple more reflections in the chat around trying to think about the piece about science not being about impact and equity not being about a part of science. One of the things we're trying to talk about is more perspectives leading to better innovation. Definitely more people in the room, not gatekeeping the room, because we're going to miss out on essential perspectives. So thank you for that, Kelly. And I'm also seeing Jamie saying, reflecting on the challenges of navigating the current administration and being effective in the work without compromising my values. I understand people are fearful and we live in a litigious country, but the number of roles and programs that are being erased in healthcare and academia is unsettling. Yes, deeply unsettling and challenging. Definitely affirm that. Another framework that I'll kind of close with and then I'll pass it along for the closing is something that we lean a lot into is Afrofuturisms and Indigenous futurisms. And what this does is it affirms that for many groups, not to bring it down, but like for many of us, an apocalypse has already happened. When we have descendants of folks who have survived genocides and survived the transatlantic slave trade and survived displacement, those were apocalyptic events for many communities, and many communities don't have many descendants to really remember or share from that. It's a dark history, but it's one we acknowledge because at the end of the day, we are still here. So how are we moving in those strategies? So even in these moments that are in some spaces apocalyptic, so the stripping of healthcare funding is slightly apocalyptic for health industry, but within that, how are we moving forward? So when we can lean into practices around imagining, around Afrofuturisms, Indigenous futurisms, it can actually help us to then be strategic in that North Star that we're moving towards, so that we know how to move through these moments while also pushing against them too. So it can seem like it's like, nihilistic or it's the end, but at the same time, within an end, we know there will still be something at the end to work with. So how are we actually working now to address the types of futures that we want to build despite what is happening and despite the challenges that we're facing, while recognizing that they are not good at all. So I'll pause there and appreciate you all for your engagement. Again, this is collective work that we'll be sharing back to you all, and pass it to other facilitators I think are going to talk about the evaluation and next steps.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Another great session. Love to see the conversation that we're having and looking forward to seeing you all next week on the 20th at the same time. If you do have a second, please fill out our end of workshops survey. This will help us kind of inform what kind of programming we want to do in the future, and any advising we are looking at, starting to plan for next year. So that's really helpful if you have any feedback for us. And as mentioned, everything will come out at the end. These are recorded and shared, as well as they will go on YouTube, and then the slides will be sent out. So everything, you don't have to worry about having kept up with everything. We will have it for you again, and something that also you can tell coworkers about, they can find online. So I think that's all from me, and I really appreciate, again, everyone being here and sharing with us, creating that collective safe environment.
Thank you all. And yeah, thank you. See you next week. And I'm excited for the conversation to continue.